They bound her with ropes the color of dried blood and called it mercy. Mara felt the cords bite into the thick fur at her shoulders and tasted iron on the wind like accusation. The elders' torches painted her ribs with shadows while the pack circled, teeth bared in ritual and contempt. Someone, an elder with a knotted white pelt and more years than the highest pines, spoke a name she hadn't earned: abomination. The word landed harder than any thang. Mara's heart hammered as if to break free of the chest that had never fit the life they boxed for her. She stood taller than the men who tried to steady her, taller than any she-wolf of the northern Matrolin, and the pack's breath smelled like old fear and the salt of secrets. Above them, the moon was a thin coin of light, indifferent. Below, the hillside trembled with a verdict that had been decided long before her collar had been fitted. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They had always said she was too big to breed, in whispers that skirted her, between hunting orders and dinner scraps, on the edge of pack feasts where children dared each other to name her faults. When Mara was a hunting beta, her size had been currency. The way she could pin a stag under a sky slashed with stars, the way 3 males faltered when she took the ridge. But currency changes hands. Tradition had hardened into superstition. Anything that threatened the tidy ledger of lineage and pairing was worn with a scarlet label. Too big, too threatening, too much. Jonah had come with notebooks and a look of perpetual apology that softened his face. He carried his voice like a cloak, pale and careful, and refused the aggressive curiosity of the townsfolk who either wanted to offend or earn instruction in lichen ways. He had come as an ethnographer, he told himself, a border town scholar with a license and a curiosity about the rituals and rules that bound wolves to themselves. He had not come to upend a verdict. He had not meant to witness a condemnation. But the day he stepped into the clearing, he saw Mara not as a beast, but as a silhouette of grief and defiance that fit the hollows of his own. When Mara's eyes found his, stormlight in the smoke of her fur, Jonah felt a memory unspool inside his ribs. Years ago, his brother had been pushed into a skirmish between packs, a boy thrown by hunger and pride into the jaws of politics. Jonah had watched the aftermath from a distance, a witness who had not intervened, and the guilt had grown like a stone he carried under his shirt. He had come to study law and ritual, to learn the bones of truces. Instead, he found a sentence being read aloud on a winter's wind. All the careful academic phrases died in his throat, and something stranger, wilder, more dangerously human rose. "I claim her," he said, before he thought of law or consequence. The word fell like a stone into the pool of the clearing. The elders froze. The pack turned to the human, a citizen of the town of Lomar, sleeves rolled, a quill-stained hand trembling at his side. Jonah's claim was illegal. A human could not, by any codified precedent the matriarchs recited like scripture, stake themselves to a lichen's fate. Claiming was the business of mates and bloodlines and the old lunar contracts. A human stake would corrupt those contracts, some argued. But the claim had power of a different kind. It was the audacity of someone who had nothing to lose. Ren's face cut the night into colder lines. The pack's alpha was iron-jawed and efficient, a leader built of discipline and calculation, not sentiment. He looked at Jonah like a man looking at a fresh wound, mildly disgusted and instantly interested in the angle. "You cannot," Ren said, But there was more in the syllables, a warning and a challenge braided together. The elders moved as if to extinguish the flame in Jonah's chest. Some barked ancient law. Others murmured about contagion if any impurity were allowed to twist the bloodlines. A few simply spat the old fear. Bigger things were unpredictable, and unpredictable things endangered the ordered edge of their world. Marah's ears tilted toward Jonah at the pronouncement. The ropes bit. So did the memory of being designated useful and then disposable. Her throat made a sound like the wind over winter reeds. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. She was used to being stared at like a thing on display, a curiosity to be measured and catalogued. But Jonah's voice had a tremor that spoke of other debts. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was courage tattooed into the soft spaces between his ribs. When he stepped forward and placed his palm against her flank, the roughness of callus met the dense fur, and something like belonging shivered between them. The pack murmured that this was an outrage. Jonah's fingers drummed stubborn cadences into Marah's hide. He spoke again, but quieter. My brother died because men who should have been wiser refused to see what was human in them. If I can make this wrong right, I will. There was no flourish to his words, no show of property or performative sacrifice. He simply said what would bind him to her. Names became laws in this world. Claims turned into contracts. Jonah's voice carried the weight of one who had hidden his family's history for fear that it would make him a target. The surname that in another life had meant broker and mediator was a family he had left behind. His silence had been survival. Now words had to be stronger than hiding. He had to stake his life, his lineage, his solitude on a she-wolf the pack had decided to kill. The reaction was immediate and violent in its variety. Some wolves howled, old superstitions making a chorus that rattled the dead leaves. Older beta spat about precedent. Younger wolves gossiped about Jonah's audacity with the wide-eyed thrill of witnessing a transgression. The children didn't yet know why it mattered. Their world arranged itself around stories, and tonight the story was unwinding. Ren's eyes fixed on Mara and then on Jonah, the scowl carving his jaw into permanent command. "This is a human provocation," he said. "You come from the town where men profit by stirring chaos at our borders, scholar. Are you here to sow discord and reap sale of blood silver?" Jonah's reply was small but steady. "I'm here to study you," he said, "to understand your laws so they don't devour you." The pack took that as impertinence or as naivete. Jonah had no armor but his words and a secret lineage. He was the last scion of a family once entrusted with ratifying truces, a human thread that had, generations back, lent legal weight to lichen covenants. He had hidden the name because to carry it was to wear a target. Now the syrinx of his throat tightened. He knew the stakes. But there was a tempered honesty in him, a refusal to be a witness turned ghost. Mara watched Jonah with a wary hunger that wasn't for food. The ropes around her were not the only thing binding. She lived a world that had bound her to shame. She had been told she was too large to fit a cradle of pairing, too ungainly to be an asset to lineage making. Her size, her strength, once prized, had calcified into a social disease. The elders had invoked myths of contagion and mutability, warning that a female who did not fit the expected form could harbor moon blood that would topple order. Rumors fed the fear that oversized she-wolves birthed monstrous litters, or that their potency corrupted the line. None of these had been proven, but superstition needed only the breath of a story to blossom. "You're the one," Mara said, once the clearing hushed. And when she spoke, it wasn't with the booming authority of an alpha, but with a voice weathered by solitude and sharp edges of long forbearance. The pack flinched at the human speech. Wolves seldom heard human words threaded into their gatherings. Jonah's hand tightened against her flank without thought. "You don't have to do this for me," she told him. "You'll be dragged into a war you don't understand. You'll be hunted by men who make money when we butcher one another." She stopped because the truth too close to her heartbeat would evaporate under scrutiny. Her longing for a bond, for the simple cruelty of being claimed and kept and named in the right way. Ren's chuckle had no warmth. "She seduces the soft-minded," he said. "This human will not survive her company. And besides, claims from townsmen change nothing. The moon cares for blood and moon care alone." He looked to the elders, hungry for reinforcement, and some nodded. Laws were lamplights in the dark. To extinguish them for novelty was unthinkable. The pack's cohesion depended on the predictability of pairings, on the ability to calculate loyalty and inheritance. A human stake, born of shame or heroism, threatened that calculation. Jonah felt the hunger of eyes on him. "I know the risks," he said, "and I know what men like my brother cost when we let fear write our laws. I'm not asking for acceptance, only for the right to try." Something in his tone, shy, stubborn, sorrow-haunted, stalled the pack's immediate dismissal. For all that wolves prided themselves on clarity and cruelty, they were creatures of story as well, and a human who chose to pair his fate to a condemned wolf was a different kind of story. Some wolves felt the urge to push Jonah down. Others felt a prick of curiosity at the thought of human defiance. Mara's thoughts braided between the present rope and memories of the ridge. She remembered nights when she'd been praised for holding the line, her muzzle cocked in a stance older than politeness. She remembered a mate once, or the idea of one, someone small of hand but fierce in loyalty, a ghost of a possibility. The pack had killed that possibility by seeding the narrative that she, by virtue of scale, upended nature. Tonight, Jonah tethered himself to her not by law, but by confessed guilt and stubborn compassion. It was a chaotic, imperfect tether, but to Mara it felt like a hand reaching through cold to grip hers. A young beta barked the practicalities. "If this claim stands, we will be held to answer. Hunters beyond the river will use this as excuse. Traders will peddle our division." The elders' faces were masks of calculation. Ren's jaw tightened. He smelled a fracture in his control, and his fingers itched at the idea of snapping it closed. He had built a pack that obeyed visible lines and invisible consequences. Jonah's claim smeared grease over those lines. "Make it legal," one of the elders demanded. "Offer proof, binding. A claim without law is chaos." They were circling toward ritual, the only language elders trusted. Jonah squeezed Mara's flank, feeling the powerful muscles under his palm and the shudder that ran through her, as if the future was a river and she stood at its bank, wet and cold. "Then make it legal," he echoed, and there was no theatrical plea in him. There was only the thin, bright edge of resolve. As they ferried words into law and law into threat, a child whimpered behind Ren's flank. The moon climbed, indifferent, and in the clearing, the first crack of inevitability opened. Mara thought of the ridge and how easily it could become a battlefield. She thought of Jonah and the odd warmth that his hand lent to her flank. She thought of renown and of being butchered because size alone was a moral failing. She thought of being called an abomination when no one had bothered to learn her name. Tonight, that name hovered near her teeth, something she might give or withhold as the world insisted upon verdicts. When the ritual preliminaries were set and the elders called for a fast to weigh the spiritual tides, Jonah was offered a place by the fire, an insult but also an acknowledgement that either the pack would fold him into their gossip or tear him like prey. He sat at the edge, his palms still smelling faintly of ink and rope, and watched Mara as if watching a tutor of grief conduct an exam. The ropes around her glow with torchlight, threading her into the pack's story. She had been marked for slaughter by law and fear. That she stood now with a human who declared himself claim sparked a new story, one that would press at old hierarchies and force a reckoning none of them wanted. The night folded around them like the last page of a book about to be torn from the spine. In the silence, voices murmured of blood moons and ancient strains, and of outlawed lunar lines that hid in oversized litters. Somewhere beyond the ridge, too, men in town were already muttering wagers. Jonah's secret lineage hummed an old song under his teeth: negotiation, brokered peace, the memory that human hands had once sealed wolf packs. He had left that life, and now it seemed to him that leaving it had been a flight. Standing in the clearing, he felt the pull back. If he did not press his palm harder into Mara's flank, would she be taken at dawn? Mara lifted her muzzle and let out a breath that fogged and flared. "Give me a name," she told Jonah, not as a request, but as a challenge. "If you're going to call yourself my claim, call me something that isn't a verdict." Jonah's throat tightened. He knew the power of names in this world better than anyone in the clearing. To name was to tether, to promise, to own, and to be owned in turn. He had come to study law. He had not expected to live it in a single exhalation. He looked down at his hands, at the ink that would never wash out, and at the rope that held her. He understood the history in his bones and the danger in his chest. He nodded once, and the word that would bind them both slipped into the air like a small offering: Mara. Mara, the name fluttered through the clearing like a bird freed from a trap. It landed, incongruous and small against the enormity of what had led them here: ropes, laws, and the old calculus of survival. When Jonah spoke it, his voice cracked like ice. When the pack took it up, it scraped against teeth and rituals, an unfamiliar syllable that trembled in air already heavy with verdict. She pressed her muzzle into his palm as if to test whether the sound had weight enough to stop the knives aimed at her throat. Jonah's fingers dug without thinking into fur that yielded like warm earth. And for a heartbeat, both of them allowed the lie, that naming might be enough to change everything. It was not enough. Words were candles in a wind that had spent itself on 1,000 fears. Wren rose as if to his full height, and the clearing's shadows seemed to tighten around him like a cloak. "Names do not make law," he said. His voice was even, the kind of cold that had kept packs aligned along its spine for years. "Claims do. Proof does. Ritual does. You pledged a human oath in a hole of pride, Jonah of Lomar, and you have made enemies of 1,000 contracts you do not understand." Jonah's jaw tightened. He had expected this, expected Wren's calculation, expected the elders to clutch at pretexts. But the hope that a name could hold space for mercy half splintered with each syllable Wren deployed. Still, Jonah spoke, and his voice had the stubbornness of someone who had practiced speaking to strangers in rooms where silence had meant judgment. "Name or no name, you cannot slaughter her for myth. She is a wolf who has held the ridge for us all. She is not a curse." "You speak for a wolf now? Human legs will not carry your cowardice when traitors come asking about your lineage." The jibes were small, meant to poke and reveal. Mara could have laughed at the pettiness, but the laugh turned hollow, and landing in Jonah's palm felt like offering him a shard. He didn't flinch. The elders conferred, and their whispers were like the sliding of rocks. Tradition needed to flex, or it would fracture. Historical precedent needed to be cited in so many voices that even the boldest dissent would seem foolish. A ritual was proposed, a binding that would require Jonah to stand publicly, to swear his blood and his life as guarantee of Mara's restraint until such a night that the elders deemed it safe. If he failed, the pact would be invoked and Mara condemned regardless. If he succeeded, the elder said, maybe, and only maybe, the pack could save face. "You're asking a man who is not bound by blood to mark himself?" an elder hissed. "If he breaks, we will have more than a condemned she-wolf. We will have a broken law." The words were legalistic, but soft as a blade. Jonah felt the hunger of the pack, their need for precedent to remain clean, for outcomes to remain predictable. He felt how small the human was next to the forces he had challenged. But Jonah had a different hunger now, not for the clean lines of law, but for something messier, redemption that hurt in the chest like new muscle. "Make it public," Ren said at last, with the thin lacing of a man who wanted to keep his options. "If he is willing to swear his life in a right before the moon, then the pack will judge with all the weight we possess. If not, the laws remain." Jonah looked at Mara, at the brittle light in her eyes. He could see the calculus shift in her, stoic acceptance, the long training of someone who had been taught to brace for blows. She had been prepared to die for a ridge. She had not been prepared to have a human stand in front of that cliff and demand a different ending. Mara's pail brushed Jonah's knee, a small animal prod that held the full vocabulary of trust and skepticism. "Do it," she coaxed, soft and guttural. "Make them see what they can't see, or make them kill you cleanly, and we can both be spared the torture of limbo." Limbo was a slow thing, and it had been her steady companion for a long time. Jonah's decision to step into ritual and bind himself to Mara would make him a mark in the human market of the riverside and beyond. Traders would use his name as bait. Hunters who made coin of conflict would sharpen arrows at the thought of a human who had agreed to be lamb for a wolf. And yet, the idea of stepping back now, of walking away and letting tradition gulp down the living and name it law, tasted like the same cowardice that had hollowed his brother's life. "Then, we'll do it," Jonah said, voice low as the kindling in the fire. "We'll be marked by the right. We'll be bound." His admission made him dizzy with a strange, rising terror that was more intimate than any fear he had catalogued in dusty folios. He had lived his life as an observer. Tonight, he would become a participant whose blood could be spilled. He pressed his fingers harder into Mara's hide, as if to translate his words into muscle memory. Preparations moved like clockwork. Tokens were fetched, a strip of Jonah's shirt cut and woven into the rope that already bit Mara's shoulders. The quiet chime bone of the pack's ritual bell clanged. Jonah's family crest, a faded image of two hands clasped over an oak, was produced by a trembling elder who remembered barter and treaty. "You are a broker's blood," the elder said to Jonah, "but not all brokers are calm. Will you use your words as weights, or will they be feathers to be scattered?" When Jonah replied, he felt the elder's weight settle like snow upon his shoulders. "I will use them as anchors," he said, because his family had birthed mediators who understood that talk could be as binding as blood. The pack's fire cast flames across faces lined like old bark. Children circled closer to the edge, eager for the drama of a living history lesson. Mara's head dipped. She seemed almost foolish in her humility, a giant who had the patience of granite. The rite began under a moon too thin to child the old myths. Jonah spoke the words the elders required, reciting solemn claims and penalties, aligning himself with consequences that could unmake him. Language in wolf ritual had the force of law and the bite of truth. To speak was to summon bones and ghosts. When Jonah bared his wrist, the elders paused. It was an intimate act, opening his blood to witness. Mara turned her head and placed her jaw atop his knee, offering for the first time an ungloved intimacy between human and wolf that made unexpected things tremble in Jonah's chest. The knife was passed, dull and ceremonial. Jonah's skin parted in a precise line, a small pinprick that bled onto his palm. He let the blood bead like a promise, and then he placed the red beaded palm against Mara's flank. The sensation was electric, a human warmth surging into animal heat. There are moments when all law feels hollow, and then moments when it is sharp as a blade. Jonah felt both. The pack watched, some with predatory interest, some with sympathy they could not yet name. A child whimpered, an elder coughed. Ren's face was unreadable. The blood soaked into the rope, and into the fur, and into something else that no law could easily categorize. The seal of two beings choosing each other, regardless of the maps men and wolves had drawn. The elders chanted the binding, old syllables meant to align souls and futures. And when the last phrase landed, Jonah's pulse felt like an animal within him. He had not felt this naked in a long time, not since the funeral of his brother when he had realized the limits of witness. He had bound himself to Mara in sight of wolves who might later choose her death. As the ritual ended, the pack's immediate wrath seemed to dim into calculation. A few claws scraped the hard earth, considering angles. Some wolves walked away with their own problems to gnaw on. The elders declared a temporary stay, a brittle, conditional grace, and Ren, with a look that was both conceding and dangerous, announced that Jonah would have 1 week to prove that his claim would not unravel the pack's security. "You will live among us," Ren said. "You will hunt. You will learn our laws in practice. 1 week." Jonah swallowed. The word 1 week sat heavy, a thin promise that could be stretched into eternity or snapped like old sinew. Mara let out a long breath, the sound like the shifting of a grown thing into a new space. The ropes around her shoulders were still tight, but the wires of doom were slackened. Jonah rose with an odd gait, as though his legs were discovering their citizenship in a new country. The fire popped. Someone tossed another log into it, and sparks rose in the air like questions. When the crowd thinned, when only low murmurs remained and the children had been shushed into a game about pack law, Mara moved her head and nudged Jonah as if to offer him a private jury. "A week," she reminded him softly. "Prove them wrong. Or don't. Either will have a price." Jonah laughed once, a brief and fragile sound. "You said give you a name," he replied. "You didn't say it would be a deadline." He meant the joke to ease the tension, but it did little more than expose the thinness of humor against the magnitude of what they now shared. He looked at Mara properly for the first time, seeing truly the winter smoke of her fur, the freighted stormlight of her eyes, the small scars along her flanks that mapped out fights they hadn't narrated. Her size had been a curse and a blessing. It was also the atlas of her life. Mara's ears flattened in a way that was not surrender. "Ridge," she said at last, a small, single word that was as much a command as it was memory. "We will go to the ridge. They will watch. Let them see me stand where I belong. Let them see you stand beside me." Jonah felt the old ache in his chest twist and soften. Standing beside her would not be cosmetic. It would be a lesson in living with danger. He had always thought of himself as a quiet thing, holding knowledge like a lamp. Now the lamp would have to be used in real weather. They left the clearing as the pack reassembled for the watch. Jonah gathered his things with a clumsy reverence, wrapping his remaining strip of shirt around his wrist until the cotton became a second skin. The town of Lomar and its muted human scams felt very far away when the wind carried Wolfsong up from the valley. And he understood that he had chosen a life in which men might find him inconvenient and wolves might find him naive. Mara padded beside him, enormous and attentive, and Jonah had the sudden, absurd urge to ask how one walked beside a creature built to command hills. "Step where I step," she told him simply. "Don't be afraid." The instruction was command and concern braided together. His heart caught on it. As they climbed toward the ridge in the thin, cold light of a lunar promise, Jonah felt the push and pull between two worlds more keenly than he had in any archive he'd ever read. The elders had given them a week. The pack had given them a public stage. The world beyond the woods had already begun the rumor mill. What remained was the work, to make a human's claim more than a spectacle, and to make a she-wolf's large body into something the pack could respect without killing. They walked in silence, the night holding its breath as if the woods themselves were listening. Each step was a rehearsal for a confrontation yet to come, and Jonah felt the thin line of terror and exhilaration braid around his ribs. He had come to study law. He had not come to become a footnote in it. Now he was both actor and evidence, and Mara, who had been marked for slaughter, would stand with him on a ridge that had always known the weather of blood and snow. The emotional pull of the next 7 days would be to teach them how to lean into each other without collapsing. They woke before the sun, the ridge slick with frost, and the kind of silence that presses against your chest until you can hear the blood in your ears. Jonah moved with the clumsy deliberation of a man who had learned to walk among wolves that morning. Careful footfalls, eyes lowered to avoid offense, hands busy with small tasks that made him look like he belonged. Mara took the lead as she always had, huge feet finding the ancient grooves of the path. Her flank brushed him at intervals, a steady, animal punctuation that kept his mind from spinning into the story the pack would tell later. Already, the morning air tasted like rumor and iron. Traders in Lomar would trade more than fish for news of blood and law. They reached the ridge before most had risen, and the world opened like an accusation. From that high point, the valley looked small and brittle, houses like toothpicks, rivers like silver threads. The pack had arranged seating like a tribunal, betas in the front, the elders half-squared, children closer to the back edge where curiosity and fear tangled most readily. Ren stood off to the side, his shoulders broad and unmoved. He wore that expression of a man who'd measured risk and deemed the moment useful. His acceptance, framed as a challenge, sat between them like a cold stone. Jonah's hands shook when he adjusted the rope that held Mara's shoulders. He was unpracticed at tying knots that meant more than utility. The rope had the familiar scent of smoke and late-night councils. For Mara, ropes were past and future both, ropes that had bound her to a fate she hadn't chosen, and ropes that now, paradoxically, knitted Jonah into her defense. She sniffed the air and then Jonah, and for a pulse they were simply two beings standing in the old work of the world. Then the crowd hummed, and the trial began. The first challenge was raw, the kind that asked a body to answer what law and speech could not. Ren arranged for a mock hunt at a flank a mile from the ridge. 3 of the best males, cunning and fast, would close on a stag while Mara defended the watchpoint. If she held, they would have to concede skill. If she fell, the law would call it evidence. Jonah's stomach nodded at the idea. The truth of a body, the way it could be tested by movement, by endurance, by a raw trial, was both the most honest and cruelest judge. Mara's eyes flared. "I do this for the ridge," she told Jonah quietly, "not for their certificates." He heard the old pride beneath her resignation, and it made his chest ache. To prove yourself to wolves who had already decided you were a threat was a cruelty shaped like ritual. Yet to refuse the trial was to be painted as cowardice, which in that language was its own death sentence. They descended to the hunting ground. Dust rose like apology. The stag broke from cover with a lightning snort, and for a second the world narrowed to muscle and intent. Mara moved like a thing sculpted for this purpose. Huge strides, a torso that could anchor the wind. The males ran a half circle, their jaws working in the law of hunt, the choreography of dominance and hunger. Jonah watched as if seeing something sacred profaned, then reclaimed. Mara's shoulder hit the stag, the animal flailed, the males closed in, and Mara took the ridge in a sweep that was both defense and map. When the dust settled, the stag lay alive and panting, A chewed tendon had given it a crooked gait, but its life was spared. The males sniffed at Mara with the reluctant respect of those confronted with competence they had misread as threat. There was a low sound in the crowd that might have been approval. Ren's jaw clenched and then relaxed. "You hold for the ridge," he said, as if the words were payments in a treaty. But words like that are small change next to fear. The elders took the result and turned it into a new kind of argument. Yes, she held, but what of litters, what of strains awakened under a different moon? The phantom danger of genetics was returned to the table like a ceremonial knife. As the week unfurled, the challenges shifted. There were physical tests, endurance hunts, mock defenses, tracking and weather meant to strip warmth from marrow. And social tests, crueler because less definable. Mara was placed in situations that asked restraint where she had seen opportunity, given tasks that would force her to soften or to be accused of failing to soften. Jonah was asked to hunt alongside her, to match his awkwardness against her expertise. Each misstep of his exposed him to the pack's humor, and worse, to traitors who had begun to place bets on whether the human would be brave enough to stay. The hardest tests, though, were of secrecy. Jonah had expected his family name to be a quiet ghost. He did not anticipate the men from his town who would come with offers and threats. Word of his claims spread downstream like a stain. A thin-faced man in a leather coat, one of the river traders, arrived with the kind of smile that had no warmth. He offered Jonah coin and safe passage in return for his renouncing Mara, and, less explicitly, for a story to be sold about a brave human who had changed his mind. "Walk away," the trader said, tapping a coin that could buy a small house. "You have one sane life, scholar. Do not throw it away for a wolf that will bring you death." The offer smelled of calculation and contempt. Jonah felt something hot and ugly coil in him, the familiar urge to flee. He also felt a newer heat, the stubbornness of a man who had decided in a clearing he would not be a passive witness again. That night, Jonah was hunted by a different truth, one that had nothing to do with traders and everything to do with his own family. An envelope, sealed with the old broker crest, arrived tucked under the boards of his bunk. Inside were two things: a letter with a single sentence, "We do not negotiate with anomalies," and a coin stamped with the sigil of the family who had once brokered wolf-human pacts. The sentence read like a dismissal and an order. Jonah's chest slammed against him. The family he had thought dead to himself had chosen discipline over tenderness. In the inked rejection, he tasted the old guilt again, the memory of his brother's limp body, of how silence had been safe and lethal at once. He carried the coin to Mara that night. The ridge was a black spine against the sky. Stars were thin and indifferent witnesses. He placed the coin in her paw and told her what was written inside. She turned the metal in her jaws like a priest considering an offering, then set it down and licked his knuckles. "They will use what you are against you," she said. "Humans have a law of their own. It is called profit." Her voice had the bluntness of one who'd been proved right too often. If your family won't stand, you will stand alone. Jonah felt the smallness of him then and the immensity of his choice. The coin might as well have been a stone tossed into the sea. That a name can both protect and betray is a lesson Jonah had learned too late for his brother. Now he had stepped into consequence with his eyes open. He slept poorly, nerves taut, dreams haunted by wolves and trading men and the impossible idea that love could be a kind of premeditated revolution. As the week neared its end, fractures deepened in ways that had nothing to do with ritual and everything to do with fear. A faction within the pack, young wolves tired of the elders' cold caution, began to speak of exile, a kinder euphemism for death. They argued the mathematics of risk as if lives were numbers that could be erased without consequence. An old beta who had once fought beside Mara spat venom the night the fire burned low. "You are a mistake of nature," he hissed. "Your size is danger, and this human is a foolish cradler of chaos." The words were meant to wound, and they did. Mara answered not with teeth, but with memory. She told the story, brief and blunt, of the ridge shed held and the pups shed fed in hard winters. She named allies who had learned from her, names that cut through the invective like clean blades. Some wolves shifted, some glared like wolves who'd been denied their prey. The worst fracture, the one that almost cleaved what Jonah and Mara were stitching together, came from within Jonah. He woke on the penultimate night to footsteps outside his tent and the muffled sound of a voice he had not heard since he was a boy, his father's. The man had come under cover of darkness, eyes hollow with calculation and something like grief. "Come home," his father said, and the simplicity of the request was a kind of mercy. "We can take care of you. Can't you see what you've done? This will bring men to the gates." His father's hand trembled as it passed Jonah the old coin again, the family's emblem, a weight neither of them wanted. "I do not want to lose you like I lost your brother," the elder said. The accusation was not spoken openly, but it pulsed in the pitch of the word lose. Jonah's reply was raw. "You lost him because no one stopped the war," he said. "We hide and we measure, and still boys like him die because fear is the loudest law." His father's face collapsed between stubborn pride and a tenderness that had been buried under ledger books and favors. "You don't understand what your choices mean," the elder whispered. "You are breathing fire into what order we have left." For the first time, Jonah saw a real fracture between his blood and his choice. Not only whether a human could claim a wolf, but whether a son could become a stranger to the family that birthed him. Mara listened through the thin walls of the tent, the tension of Jonah's voice cutting the night. When the elder left, Jonah sat with his back to the tent pole and let the thin moonlight lay soft lines across his face. He felt unmoored, the gravity of his choice pulling him apart at the seams. If his family renounced him, the traitors would smell weakness, and the pack, already teetering, might choose expediency over law. Jonah realized that the act of claiming Mara had not simply changed her fate, it had shifted the axis of his world. He had made enemies that would sacrifice either of them for coin or convenience. Mara crept into the tent without disturbing him, the movement of one who had learned how to be quiet in the shadow of guns and laws. She circled Jonah and placed her head on his lap. His hands found her ears, and he wept in a way that was less about his brother than about the sudden knowledge that to stand for something is to risk being broken. "We will be judged," he said into her fur, "and we might be found wanting." Mara's breath was warm and smelled of pine and hunt. "Then we will be wanting together," she said. It was not a romantic vow in the sense of fantasies. It was the gritty compact of two beings who had chosen to be visible in a world that preferred the convenience of erasure. "If they tear us apart," she added, "let them see what they lose when they kill what they fear." The day of the final reckoning dawned with a hardness that had nothing to do with weather. The pack assembled, and the valley held its breath like a body waiting for sentence. Jonah walked to the center, Mara at his flank, the rope now a symbol and not merely a restraint. Faces around them were schooled into masks of law. Children stared like priests in training. Ren watched as a man waiting for results he could use. Jonah felt the fractures. Family, traitors, the pack's own divisions, spread like spider webs through the crowd. But he also felt the thing that had made him claim her. Memory and remorse braided into stubborn courage. He did not know if it would be enough. He only knew he had already chosen, and that choice would have to stand under whatever moon came next. The ridge broke into motion like a trapped animal when the first shout split the air. Two hunters from beyond the river, faces like coin flies, spear points glittering. They had come with the blunt confidence of men who buy trouble for coin, and they brought others at their heels, a small band of mercenaries and townsmen recruited to turn a rumor into profit. Snares had been set below the ridge, ropes camouflaged in frost, and the valley smelled suddenly of iron and foot sweat, and the kind of inevitability that announces itself with the clatter of weapons. Jonah heard the sound before he saw the men, the barked words, the low laughter that meant cruelty, the animalistic excitement of men who find entertainment in engineered violence. Ren's face hardened into a policy of containment, but his stance was not swift enough. The first of the human hunters had already aimed and let fly a low bolt that skittered into the frozen earth a hair's breadth from Mara's flank. The pack erupted. Betas lunged, children scrambled for cover. Elders shouted for law because law was what they could throw at the chaos. Jonah's hands went to the rope automatically, as if to anchor himself. His breath came too quick, as if he had run a hunt without training. The mercenaries moved like a trap closing. Somewhere in the clatter, Jonah heard the traitors laugh, an ugly sound that meant blood might be for sale. Something older than ritual answered then. Mara's body tightened, the rope biting as she strained against the indignity of being commanded twice over, once by law, once by death. Her coat bristled like the edge of a storm. When she moved, it was as if the ridge itself bowed to her inevitability. She stepped forward, bigger than the space allowed, and Jonah felt his ribs rearrange around her presence. Men shouted, a young beta dove and took a bolt in the shoulder. Someone cursed, an elder spat ancient laws like a shield. "Back!" Ran roared, but he sounded like a warning in a language the traders had never been taught. They laughed and surged, and the line of men pressed like a tide. Jonah saw a mercenary raise a spear for another shot, and before thought could dress itself into sense, he launched himself forward. It wasn't bravery polished by training. It was a human flung by the raw need to be more than witness. Jonah shoved into the mercenary's ribs, the contact brutal and comic, the man staggering like a felled tree. A spear grazed Jonah's shoulder, a hot, surprising agony that felt like betrayal and truth at once. He heard Mara's sound then, a long, low note that wrapped around the ridge and translated ancient moon law into immediate action. She pivoted with the clean cruelty of a thing made for survival and took the spear in her shoulder instead of Jonah. The wound was ugly, wood splintered, blood dark as winter under snow. Mara's head snapped, and Jonah's hands were at the wound before his mind could ration the action. The rope slackened enough for him to wrap his fingers in warm fur and feel the tremor beneath. She bore the hurt like a declaration. Around them the fight blurred, teeth and fists, the sick motion of men trying to make a spectacle into victory. Jonah felt the rope cut into his palm where he held it, the sound of skin and fibers tiny and terrible against the clamor. "Move him," Ran barked to the betas, and suddenly discipline reasserted itself with a speed that made Jonah dizzy. Wolves formed a shield around Mara as she leaned into Jonah's grip, blood staining the dusk of her fur like a flag that said, "This is mine." Jonah could not remember when he had last been this human, and this helpless, and this ferociously alive. He had taken a claim in a clearing, and now the claim took him back with interest, a wound that mapped itself into his skin and his soul. They dragged Mara toward the center of the ridge, makeshift litters improvised from hides and furious limbs. An elder, hands that had memorized countless ritual stitches, cursed softly and set to work. Jonah knelt at Mara's head, pressing his palms into the raw of her side, trying to staunch blood that seemed inexhaustible. Her eyes sought his, stormlight narrowing into something honest and dangerous. "Stay," she rasped, the word both command and plea. He looked up to see the mercenaries retreating, their prize gone. They had not expected the backwash of pack loyalty and the thunder of wolves unleashed. Ren watched the men go with a fury that was practical and private. The trader who had visited Jonah's tent lingered, a silhouette against the downhill light, and Jonah could see greed exacted like a lesson from a distance. When the last of the mercenaries vanished into tree line, a silence descended that felt less like relief than the settling of a wound after sutures, cautious and fragile. The elders set to work with a fervor that made Jonah ache. They tore Jonah's shirt under his hand and bound Mara's wound with cloth, knotting it tight enough to bruise. An elder murmured invocations that smelled of old curatives and blood scents. Another applied animal poultices that hissed in the cold. Jonah's hands shook as he helped, the tremor of adrenaline and negligence and new devotion. He tasted the metal of his own fear on his tongue and realized suddenly that choice is not only sacrifice, but the daily act of choosing again the moment after sacrifice has been made. He had said he would stand. The standing had cost a spear and a stitch and the sight of Mara's breath drawn like a blade. Mara's breath came in uneven gulps. Her flank rose and rose again with the stubborn cadence of something not yet broken. Jonah leaned his forehead against the warm place behind her ear and felt the muscles beneath the injury working like a map. Pain, yes, but also the inexplicable beauty of endurance. He remembered how she had once held the ridge in winter hunts, how she had carried pups and fed them while men slept. Now she lay with a human's blood on her paw and the scent of traitors on the wind. Jonah pressed his lips to the fur above her wound and let something furious and tender anchor itself to the act. "You could have left," she said, voice thin but steady. "I would have understood." He shook his head. "You nearly taught me how," he whispered. "You taught me what it meant to act." The words felt awkward and insufficient, the kind of human declarations that mean enormous things and sound small. He wanted to promise safety and had instead to promise proximity. A human tether tied to a wound, and a loyalty that would be the scandal of markets and the salvation of a wolf-sized heart. Mara's eyes softened in a way that made Jonah's chest split open. "Then stay," she said, and when she said it, she did not ask it as a question, but as a covenant. He heard the roll of syllables in the pack that would reframe the moment. Claim had been traded for action. Naming had been braided into blood, and the ritual of legality had given way to the brutality of truth. Around them, the pack worked, murmurs of admiration threaded with the old fear. Some of Ren's features had slackened. The Alpha had watched his order tested and his authority complicated by a human who had chosen exposure over safety. When they thought Mara stable enough to be moved, Jonah refused to leave her for the infirmary tents. He sat night after night at her side, hands pressed to her flank, reciting law and politics and scraps of pleading that felt both foolish and healing. He bled sleep dry and let the pack's routine tuck him into its margins. Children brought him berries. Betas grunted short, approving noises when he adjusted Mara's blanket. The elders continued to eye him like a ledger that refused to balance. On the third night, Mara rose, slow as a story finding its breath. The wound had knit enough for motion, but she moved with a limp that would be permanent, an honest mark that would declare the day to any who looked. Jonah helped her to the ridge again, this time not as a claimant proving a point, but as someone who had discovered a home in the space between law and the wild. When they reached the summit, Ren met them and, for the first time since the clearing, did not look at Jonah with the old contempt. He looked at Mara and then at Jonah, and something like grudging respect passed between the two. "You bled for your claim," Rand said, voice a blade dulled by surprise. "You chose to be visible. That is a liability and a kind of proof." The Alpha's admission was not generous, it was tactical, but it held the seed of change. The elders conferred quietly, and the week that had been measured out like an expiration date evaporated into a new clause. Jonah's claim would stand if he continued to live among them, to prove through action that he could hold to the pack's needs as he had to Mara. In return, Mara would not be slaughtered. She would be recognized as a defender with a name and a human who had bled for her. It was not a total victory. Traitors would no doubt whisper and bet, families would recite histories that would turn Jonah into either a martyr or a fool, and factions in the pack would continue to weigh cost against compassion. But as the first fin stars opened, Ren stepped back and allowed a younger Beta to approach, placing his hand against Mara's shoulder in a silence that meant something. The Alpha had yielded a piece of authority to survival no law had the will to authorize alone. Jonah drew Mara's head into his lap, feeling the soft pull of her breath. He had chosen a peril he could no longer count purely as sacrifice. It was a life remade by stitches and claims and nights of stubborn guarding. He traced the line of her scar with a careful finger, a map of what they had endured. Mara closed her eyes and, for the first time in years, let herself name the small and private relaxations of trust. The wound throbbed faintly beneath their palms, and Jonah understood that love sometimes arrives smeared with blood and law and the scent of those who would profit from both. "Stay," Mara whispered again, not asking but commanding the world to account for the oddness of a human and a she-wolf who had chosen one another. Jonah answered by kissing the place where fur met skin, a clumsy gesture that held the full theology of his new allegiance. "I will," he said, "even if it costs me everything." They sat together on the ridge as dawn blunted the edge of night. Around them the pack resumed their cadence of work and watch, an old song rewritten in the margins by two bodies who had refused the tidy cruelty of tradition. Jonah knew the fights to come would be many, lawyers in human coats, traders on river barges, pack members who would rather preserve comfort than reconcile. But in Mara's steady breathing he felt a claim that transcended law, the simple, stubborn contract of two beings who would stand in the breach for each other. The cost had been high. The reward, when it arrived at all, would be the kind that tempered people into a different shape. Smaller grudges healed, new fathers taught that size is not a sentence, and a human who had learned to stake himself in blood and not just in ink. On the ridge, the first sun cut the frost into jewels. Jonah held Mara's head and promised, in the only way that counted now, by staying. They sat until the sun polished the frost into 100 small, honest mirrors, and the ridge felt like a world they could name together. The pack moved around them in a new choreography, cautious, curious, practical, repairing what had frayed without pretending the unraveling had not happened. Jonah found his hands doing things he had never thought to do, mending a splintered spear for a young Beta who had lost his edge, boiling bitter herbs the elders approved with a nod, teaching a child the proper way to carve a token knot into a rope so it would not slip. Each small competence knit him further into the life he had chosen, and Mara watched with eyes that were both fierce and softer than he had deserved. They forged rhythms. Dawn hunts began to include him at Mara's side. His lack of grace was balanced by a stubborn willingness to learn, and the pack began to treat his mistakes as steps rather than signs of weakness. At night, when the fires flared and stories unspooled, Jonah spoke of law and treaties with the humility of someone who had lived both sides of paper and blade. Mara listened, and sometimes corrected him with a lift of her lips or a nudge that sent him into quiet laughter. Their conversations were not always words. Often, they were the press of bodies, the exchange of small mercies, a shared blanket, a paw placed over a palm, the rituals of tending a wound until the scar was a map rather than a scarlet accusation. Ren did not become tender overnight. He remained a man who measured consequences and kept his distance. Yet the ridge shifted around him. Practical elders adapted clauses rather than rewriting the old books, and younger wolves learned that courage wore different skins. Traders still whispered. Jonah's family still sent cold coins. Some in Lomar called him fool or saint. The choice of epitaph depended on appetite. But the pack's immediate verdict had been the one that mattered most to Mara. She had been spared slaughter. She had been named. She walked the ridge with a new, deliberate pride, scarred, larger than many thought possible to love, and claimed in a manner the old laws had never imagined. At night, Jonah would still wake and find Mara's flank against his ribs, warm and steady. He pressed his forehead to her fur and felt a pulse that seemed to answer every old question with patient insistence. You are not alone. The wound on her shoulder would never be invisible, and their life would be full of compromises, of enemies and markets, and the careful choreography of safety and truth. But when dawn came and the valley unfurled beneath them like a promise, they rose together. Jonah laced the last knot on a repaired rope, slid his hand into Mara's flank, and let the world see what law could not, what tradition could not, and what profit could not buy. A human and a she-wolf, bound by a claim that had become something else entirely. Guardian, companion, chosen family. They walked the ridge as the sun opened fully, two silhouettes against the sharpened sky, and the first warm ray caught Jonah's face as if it were blessing the place where he had learned to stand.